There are some moments in life that seem completely ordinary until you realize they were the beginning of the end. For Rachel Morgan, that moment came on an ordinary Thursday evening, when she reached into her husband's jacket looking for the car keys. She wasn't searching for evidence. She wasn't suspicious. She wasn't even thinking about Daniel's behavior. She was simply trying to find the keys because he had left them somewhere again. But her fingers found something else. A small white receipt, folded twice and tucked into the inside pocket of his jacket. Rachel almost threw it away without looking. Then she noticed the name of the hotel at the top. She knew that hotel. Everyone in their town knew it. It was expensive, private, and nearly 40 miles from their home. Rachel stared at the date. She stared at the room number. Then she looked again at the amount that had been charged to their joint account. What frightened her wasn't the hotel. It was the date. Daniel had told her he had spent that night working late at the office. And suddenly, a question she had never allowed herself to ask came rushing into her mind. What exactly had her husband been doing that night? Rachel had been married to Daniel for 24 years. At 52, she had reached an age where she no longer expected life to surprise her in dramatic ways. Their children were grown. Their mortgage was nearly paid. They had survived difficult years, family arguments, financial setbacks, and the quiet changes that come when two people grow older together. Daniel had always been the dependable one. He was the man who remembered to lock the doors, pay the bills, change the oil, and call their daughter every Sunday. He wasn't the kind of husband people whispered about. In fact, if anyone had asked Rachel whether she trusted him, she would have answered without hesitation. Completely. That was what made what happened next so painful. Betrayal rarely begins with a person you already distrust. It begins with someone whose word has become part of the foundation of your life. Research on infidelity has repeatedly described the shock, confusion, anger, and loss of security that can follow when that trust is broken. Psychology Today, and Rachel was about to discover that sometimes the hardest part isn't learning that someone lied to you. It's realizing how many times you believed them. She stood alone in the bedroom that Thursday night, still holding the receipt. Daniel was downstairs watching television. She could hear him laughing at something on the screen, completely unaware that the ordinary evening they had planned was already changing. Rachel looked at the receipt one more time. The date was 3 months earlier. She remembered that night clearly. Daniel had kissed her goodbye before leaving for what he called an emergency meeting. He had told her he might be home late. Rachel had stayed awake until almost midnight, worried that he was exhausted. When he finally came home, he had apologized for the hour, kissed her forehead, and told her the meeting had gone badly. She remembered asking whether everything was okay. Daniel had said yes. He had looked tired. He had looked convincing. Rachel had believed him. Now she wondered whether she had been looking at a tired husband that night or a man who had simply become very good at hiding the truth. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what Rachel found on that receipt was only the first piece of a story she didn't know she was living. At first, she tried to explain it away. Maybe Daniel had used the hotel for a business meeting. Maybe his company had paid for a room. Maybe there was an innocent explanation he had forgotten to mention. Rachel wanted one. She needed one. After 24 years together, the idea that her husband could deliberately deceive her felt almost impossible to accept. So she did what people often do when the truth threatens everything they thought they understood. She searched for another explanation. She put the receipt on the dresser, walked downstairs, and joined Daniel on the couch. He looked over at her and smiled. Rachel smiled back. Then he reached for her hand. And for the first time in 24 years, Rachel wondered whether she was holding the hand of the man she married, or a man she had never really known. For 24 years, Rachel Morgan had believed she knew exactly who Daniel Morgan was. They had met when Rachel was 28 and Daniel was 31, at a friend's backyard barbecue on a warm summer afternoon. There was nothing dramatic about their first meeting. Daniel wasn't the loudest man at the party, and Rachel wasn't looking for romance. But he made her laugh. He listened when she spoke, remembered little details, and somehow made conversation feel effortless. Within a year, they were married. Over the years, their life became the kind of life Rachel had once dreamed about. They bought a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, raised their children, celebrated birthdays around the same dining table, and slowly built a comfortable life together. There had been arguments, of course. No marriage survives 24 years without them. But Rachel had always believed that disagreements were temporary while commitment was permanent. Daniel had never given her a reason to think otherwise. At least, that's what she believed. Their children had grown up watching their parents handle life's difficulties together. Their daughter, Emily, had once told Rachel that she hoped to have a marriage like hers someday. Their son, Matthew, often joked that Daniel was impossible to impress because he always seemed to know when something wasn't right. Rachel had laughed at that comment many times. Daniel was observant, organized, and careful. He was the person everyone called when they needed help. If a neighbor's car wouldn't start, Daniel would be outside with jumper cables. If someone needed advice about money, they called Daniel. If Rachel had a problem, he was usually the first person she wanted to tell. That was why the receipt felt so strange. It wasn't simply a piece of paper. It was a contradiction. It suggested that the man Rachel trusted most had a life she knew nothing about. Still, she didn't accuse him. She didn't confront him. She convinced herself there had to be an explanation. And the next morning, when Daniel kissed her goodbye before leaving for work, Rachel almost told him about the receipt. Almost. Instead, she watched him walk through the front door and disappear down the driveway. For the next few days, Rachel tried to forget about it. She returned to her normal routine. She went grocery shopping, answered emails, spoke with her sister on the phone, and kept up with the small responsibilities that filled her days. But something had changed. She began noticing things she had previously ignored. Daniel's phone had always been beside him, but now he seemed unwilling to leave it unattended. If he went into another room, the phone went with him. If a message arrived while they were eating dinner, he would glance at the screen and turn the phone face down. Rachel told herself she was imagining things. After 24 years, people changed. Maybe Daniel simply wanted more privacy. Maybe work had become stressful. Maybe she was allowing one hotel receipt to make everything else look suspicious. But then, one Tuesday evening, Daniel came home nearly 2 hours later than usual. Rachel asked him where he had been. He paused for just a moment before answering. Traffic was terrible. It was an ordinary answer. It should have ended the conversation. Instead, Rachel noticed something that made her stomach tighten. Daniel wouldn't look directly at her. That night, Rachel lay awake beside him. Daniel was already asleep, breathing quietly as if nothing in the world had changed. Rachel stared at the ceiling and replayed the past few months in her mind. There had been other late nights, other unexplained errands, other moments when Daniel seemed distracted while she was talking. None of them had seemed important individually. Together, they began forming a picture Rachel didn't want to see. The next morning, she finally did something she had never imagined doing to her husband. She checked their bank account. Not because she wanted to invade his privacy, she told herself, but because the hotel receipt had been paid with their joint card. She opened the recent transactions and started scrolling. At first, everything looked normal. Groceries, utilities, gas, restaurant payments. Then she saw another hotel charge. This one was from 6 weeks earlier. Rachel stared at the screen. She remembered that week too. Daniel had told her he was attending an out-of-town business dinner, but the hotel wasn't in the city where his office was located. It was only 20 minutes from their own house. Rachel sat quietly at the kitchen table, looking at the bank statement on her phone. She felt embarrassed by how quickly her mind began searching for explanations. Maybe Daniel had booked the room for someone else. Maybe there had been a business meeting she didn't know about. Maybe the company had reimbursed him. But if that were true, why hadn't he mentioned it? She began scrolling further. There were more charges. Not many. Just enough to make her uncomfortable. A restaurant she had never heard of. A jewelry store. A second hotel. Then a payment at a small coffee shop across town. Rachel knew that coffee shop. She had passed it dozens of times. It was the kind of place people went when they wanted to sit quietly and talk. She put her phone down. Her hands were trembling. For the first time, Rachel understood that the receipt wasn't an isolated mistake. It might be part of something that had been happening for months. And if Daniel had been hiding those meetings, the question was no longer whether he had a secret. The question was how much of their marriage had been built around it. That evening, Rachel watched Daniel come through the front door, carrying his briefcase. He smiled and asked how her day had been. She looked at him and realized she was seeing him differently. Every familiar gesture suddenly seemed capable of having another meaning. When he placed his phone on the kitchen counter, Rachel noticed that he immediately picked it up again when it vibrated. When he asked what they should have for dinner, she wondered where he had eaten the previous evening. When he kissed her cheek, She wondered whether he had kissed someone else that same week. Rachel hated herself for thinking that way. She wanted to trust him. She wanted her old life back. More than anything, she wanted to believe that 24 years could not be erased by a few suspicious transactions and one hotel receipt. But then Daniel looked at her and said something that would stay with Rachel for a very long time. "You know I'd never lie to you, right?" Rachel looked into his eyes, and instead of feeling reassured, she felt something inside her go completely still. For the next several days, Rachel Morgan said almost nothing. She went through the motions of a normal life, but inside, something had shifted. Daniel continued behaving as though everything was fine. He went to work in the morning, came home in the evening, asked Rachel about her day, and sat beside her during dinner. If Rachel hadn't known about the hotel receipts, she might have believed nothing had changed. But now she was watching him differently. She noticed when he turned his phone away from her. She noticed when he stepped outside to take a call. She noticed the way his expression changed whenever a message arrived. And perhaps most unsettling of all, she noticed how quickly he could return to normal afterward. Rachel didn't want to become the kind of wife who searched through her husband's belongings or questioned every unexplained expense. She had never imagined herself living that way. So she made herself a promise. She would look for one honest explanation before she made any accusation. She didn't know it yet, but that decision would lead her to a discovery she could never take back. The first opportunity came on a Saturday morning. Daniel told Rachel he needed to run a few errands before lunch. He picked up his keys, kissed her cheek, and walked toward the front door. Rachel watched him leave through the kitchen window. Something about the way he moved bothered her. It wasn't anything obvious. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't nervous. He looked completely ordinary. But Rachel had learned that ordinary could hide a great deal. About 20 minutes later, Daniel's phone rang inside the house. Rachel looked toward the counter. She knew she shouldn't touch it. She almost walked away. Then the screen lit up with a message preview. She didn't see a name clearly, only a short sentence. "We need to talk about what happened." Rachel froze. Her heart began pounding. Before she could read anything else, the screen went dark. She stood there staring at the phone. She didn't pick it up. She didn't open it. But now there was something the hotel receipts couldn't explain away. Someone was contacting Daniel about something they apparently both knew about. When Daniel returned, Rachel was sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee. She watched him place the grocery bag on the counter. He smiled and asked why she looked so serious. Rachel nearly told him everything. Instead, she asked a simple question. "Who was texting you this morning?" Daniel stopped for half a second. Then he laughed. "Work," he said. Rachel nodded. "On a Saturday?" she asked. Daniel shrugged and said one of his colleagues was having a problem. It was a believable answer. That was the problem. Almost every answer Daniel gave her was believable. Rachel didn't argue. She didn't accuse him. She simply watched him put his phone into his pocket. Later that afternoon, Daniel went upstairs to shower. His phone remained downstairs. Rachel looked at it from across the room. She walked toward it, then stopped. She felt ashamed even thinking about what she was considering. But another thought was stronger. If Daniel was telling the truth, there would be nothing to find. Rachel didn't touch the phone that afternoon. Instead, she decided to follow the money. She opened the bank statements again and began writing down the transactions she couldn't explain. There were only a handful, but they created a pattern. Hotels, restaurants, a jewelry store, a coffee shop. Then she found something that made her stop. 3 of the suspicious transactions had occurred on dates when Daniel had told her he was working late. Rachel took out a notebook and wrote each date down. She remembered every one. On one of those evenings, Daniel had come home carrying flowers. He had told her he was sorry for missing dinner and wanted to make it up to her. Rachel had been touched. She had put the flowers in a vase and kissed him. Now she stared at the date in her notebook. The flowers hadn't erased anything. They had only made the lie feel more convincing. That night, Rachel asked Daniel about his work again. She didn't mention the hotel. She didn't mention the bank account. She simply asked whether his schedule had changed recently. Daniel said work had become busier. He told her there were new clients and more meetings. Rachel listened carefully. Then she asked where the meetings were usually held. Daniel named several places. Rachel recognized one immediately. It was the same area where the hotel charges had appeared. Her heart sank. She didn't challenge him. Instead, she changed the subject. Daniel relaxed almost instantly. He began talking about their daughter Emily and a family gathering they were planning. Rachel listened, but she could barely hear him. She was beginning to understand something frightening. Daniel wasn't simply hiding something. He was prepared. He had explanations ready. He knew what to say before Rachel even asked the questions. And if that was true, then whatever secret he was protecting had probably existed for much longer than she had imagined. The following Monday, Rachel made a decision. She would find out where Daniel went when he said he was working late. She didn't want to follow him. She didn't want to become suspicious of every movement he made. But she needed one answer. That evening, Daniel told her he had another late meeting. Rachel watched him leave. 10 minutes later, she grabbed her coat and got into her car. She kept several car lengths behind him as he drove through familiar streets. Daniel passed the office district. He continued toward the other side of town. Rachel's hands tightened around the steering wheel. Then Daniel turned into a parking lot. Rachel slowed down and stopped across the street. She watched him get out of the car. He wasn't at an office. He wasn't at a business meeting. He walked toward a small cafe she had seen on the bank statement. Rachel sat completely still. Then a second car pulled into the parking lot. A woman stepped out. Daniel looked up, and when Rachel saw the way he smiled at her, she knew the hotel receipts had only been the beginning. Rachel didn't move. She sat behind the steering wheel with both hands resting in her lap, watching Daniel and the woman outside the cafe. For several seconds, she tried to convince herself that she was looking at something innocent. Maybe it was a colleague. Maybe it was a client. Maybe Daniel's smile meant nothing. But then the woman reached out and touched his arm, and Daniel leaned closer as they spoke. Rachel felt a cold emptiness settle over her. She had spent days telling herself that there was another explanation. Now she was watching the explanation standing directly in front of her. She wanted to get out of the car. She wanted to walk across the street and demand answers. Instead, she stayed where she was. Something told her that if she confronted Daniel now, he would have time to create another explanation. So Rachel watched. The two of them entered the cafe together. Daniel looked around before following her inside. That small gesture told Rachel everything she needed to know. He wasn't simply meeting someone. He was making sure nobody saw him. Rachel waited nearly 20 minutes before driving home. Daniel arrived 40 minutes later. When he walked through the door, he looked completely relaxed. He took off his coat, placed his keys on the counter, and asked Rachel whether she had eaten dinner. She looked at him across the kitchen and felt as though she were speaking to a stranger. "How was your meeting?" she asked. Daniel didn't hesitate. "Long," he said. "A little frustrating." Rachel nodded. She wanted to ask about the cafe. She wanted to ask about the woman. But instead, she said she was tired and went upstairs. That night, she barely slept. She kept seeing Daniel's face when he saw the woman. It wasn't the face of a man surprised to see someone. It was the face of a man who had been waiting to see her. By morning, Rachel had made another decision. She wasn't going to confront Daniel until she knew exactly who the woman was. The next day, Rachel began looking for answers. She didn't have a name, but she had a few details. She knew the cafe. She knew the area. She knew Daniel had been meeting the woman there. Rachel thought about the suspicious transactions again and remembered the jewelry store. She wondered whether the woman had received the jewelry. That thought hurt more than she expected. Rachel had spent years believing that the small things Daniel did for her meant something. The anniversary dinners, the flowers, the surprise gifts, the handwritten cards. Now she wondered whether some of those gestures had been guilt rather than affection. She opened an old drawer in their bedroom where they kept photographs, receipts, and personal documents. As she searched, she found an old photograph from a neighborhood gathering several years earlier. Rachel almost put it away. Then she noticed someone standing behind her and Daniel. A woman. Rachel stared at the photograph. She recognized the face, but she couldn't immediately remember from where. Her name was Claire Bennett. Rachel had known Claire for almost 15 years. Claire wasn't a stranger. She wasn't a distant acquaintance. She was someone Rachel had invited into her home. Someone who had sat across from her at the dinner table. Someone who had attended birthdays and family celebrations. Someone Rachel had trusted enough to leave alone in her house. Claire had been Rachel's closest friend for years. They had shared personal conversations, family problems, vacations, and countless cups of coffee. Rachel had told Claire things she had never told anyone else. She had talked about the difficult years of her marriage. She had talked about her fears of growing older. She had even told Claire that Daniel was the one person she believed would never betray her. Now Rachel looked at the photograph again, and her hands began to shake. The woman outside the cafe hadn't simply looked familiar. Rachel had been looking at her best friend. The discovery left Rachel sitting on the bedroom floor, surrounded by old photographs. She remembered Claire's behavior over the previous year, the questions she had asked about Daniel's work schedule, the occasions when Claire seemed to know things about Daniel before Rachel told her, the strange way Claire had defended him whenever Rachel complained about his long hours. Rachel remembered one evening when Claire had casually said, "Daniel works too hard. You should give him some space." At the time, Rachel had thought it was friendly advice. Now the memory sounded completely different. There were dozens of little moments like that. None had seemed suspicious when they happened, but together, they formed a history Rachel had never noticed. She wondered how long Claire had known Daniel in a way Rachel hadn't understood. She wondered whether their friendship had been real at all. That afternoon, Rachel called Claire. Her voice remained calm. She asked if Claire wanted to meet for coffee. Claire immediately agreed. Rachel chose a cafe across town. She wanted somewhere public, somewhere neutral, somewhere Claire couldn't easily leave without answering questions. When Claire arrived, she smiled as she walked toward Rachel's table. She looked exactly the same as always. The same warm expression, the same familiar voice, the same woman Rachel had trusted for years. Claire sat down and asked Rachel how she was doing. Rachel looked at her for several seconds before answering. "I'm fine," she said. Then she asked a question that made Claire's smile disappear. "Have you seen Daniel recently?" Claire looked down at the table. It lasted only a second, but Rachel noticed. Claire finally said no. Rachel didn't respond. She simply watched her friend. Then Rachel asked, "Are you sure?" Claire became defensive. She asked why Rachel was asking such a strange question. Rachel didn't reveal what she knew. Instead, she asked whether Claire had been to the cafe near Daniel's office recently. Claire's face changed again. This time, Rachel knew. She didn't need a confession. She could see it in Claire's eyes. Rachel leaned back in her chair. The woman who had spent 15 years listening to her secrets was now sitting across from her, trying to decide which lie would work. Finally, Claire whispered, "Rachel, I can explain." Those 4 words broke something inside Rachel. Because people don't say, "I can explain," when there is nothing to explain. Rachel left the cafe without raising her voice. She didn't scream. She didn't cry in front of Claire. She simply walked outside and sat in her car. For several minutes, she stared through the windshield. She had spent the last 24 years worrying about whether Daniel had betrayed her. Now she understood that the betrayal had another face. It belonged to someone who knew exactly where Rachel was vulnerable. Someone who knew about her marriage, her family, her fears, and her trust. Someone she had welcomed into her life. But Rachel still didn't know the most important part. She didn't know how long Daniel and Claire had been involved. She didn't know what Daniel had promised Claire. And she didn't know why Claire had been willing to risk 15 years of friendship. Then Rachel's phone rang. It was Daniel. She stared at his name on the screen for several seconds before answering. His voice sounded completely normal. "Rachel," he said, "we need to talk." Rachel closed her eyes. For the first time, she realized that Daniel already knew she had discovered the truth. Rachel stared at Daniel's name on her phone for several seconds before answering. Her hand was shaking, but her voice was surprisingly calm. "Hello." There was a pause on the other end. Then Daniel said, "Where are you?" Rachel looked through the windshield at the cafe she had just left. "I'm out," she replied. Daniel didn't ask where. Instead, he said something that made Rachel's stomach tighten. "We need to talk before you make any decisions." Rachel closed her eyes. He knew. Somehow, Daniel already knew what had happened. She asked him how he knew she had spoken to Claire. Daniel didn't answer immediately. That silence told Rachel more than any explanation could have. Finally, he said, "Please come home." Rachel almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. After 24 years of marriage, she had spent days trying to understand what was happening. Now the man she trusted was asking her to come home, so he could explain why he had been meeting her best friend behind her back. Rachel started the car and drove home, knowing that whatever happened next would change their marriage forever. Daniel was waiting in the living room when Rachel walked through the front door. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting. He was sitting quietly on the edge of the sofa with his hands clasped together. For some reason, that frightened Rachel more than anger would have. She put her purse down and remained standing. "How long?" she asked. Daniel looked at the floor. "Rachel," she interrupted him. "How long have you and Claire been seeing each other?" Daniel finally looked up. His face had changed. The confidence she had seen so many times before was gone. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Rachel asked again. This time her voice cracked. How long? Daniel took a slow breath and said, almost a year. Rachel felt as though the room had suddenly become too small. Almost a year. 12 months of birthdays, dinners, conversations, good mornings, good nights, and ordinary moments that she had believed were real. 12 months during which Claire had been sitting across from her, asking how her marriage was going while secretly being involved with her husband. Rachel walked to the dining table and placed both hands on the back of a chair. She needed something solid to hold on to. Did she know about me? She asked. Daniel looked confused by the question. Of course she knew about you. Rachel shook her head. No. I mean, did she know what you were doing to me? Daniel didn't answer. Rachel understood. Claire knew. She had known exactly who Rachel was. She had known about their marriage, their children, their history, and the trust Rachel had placed in her. Yet she had continued. Daniel tried to explain that it hadn't started as an affair. He said he and Claire had become friends through work and that their conversations had gradually become more personal. He said he had been unhappy for a long time, but hadn't known how to tell Rachel. Then he said the sentence Rachel would remember for the rest of her life. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Rachel looked at him and asked, but when did you decide to keep letting it happen? Daniel had no answer. That was the moment Rachel stopped looking for an explanation that could make the betrayal acceptable. She realized that whatever had happened at the beginning, there had been hundreds of opportunities to stop. Daniel could have told her the truth. He could have walked away from Claire. He could have asked for help with their marriage. Instead, he had chosen secrecy again and again. Rachel asked about the hotel. Daniel admitted that some of the hotel visits had been with Claire. The restaurant charges were also connected to her. The jewelry store made Rachel's heart sink. She asked what he had bought. Daniel hesitated before telling her it had been a necklace. Rachel remembered that month. It had been their anniversary. Daniel had given Rachel flowers and a card. He had told her he was sorry they couldn't afford a bigger celebration that year. She had believed him. Now she understood that he had spent money on another woman around the same time he had been telling his wife they needed to be careful with money. Rachel's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. Then Daniel said something unexpected. Claire wanted me to leave you. Rachel looked at him. And did you want to? Daniel remained silent. That silence was enough. Rachel asked him again. Did you want to leave me? Daniel finally admitted that he had considered it. Rachel sat down slowly. She had prepared herself for anger, but she hadn't prepared herself for that. The idea that her husband had sat somewhere with another woman and imagined a life without her was more painful than the affair itself. She thought about the years they had spent building their home. She thought about their children. She thought about the nights she had stayed awake when Daniel was sick, the time she had supported him when work became difficult, and the sacrifices they had both made. She wasn't asking him to repay 24 years of love. She simply couldn't understand how someone could throw away something so valuable without even giving the person beside them a chance to fight for it. Then Rachel remembered something. Why did Claire know about your schedule? Daniel looked at her. Rachel continued. Why did she know when you were working late? Why did she know about our problems? Why did she know things I only told her? Daniel looked away. Rachel's voice became firmer. How much did you tell her about me? Daniel didn't answer. And once again, Rachel realized there was more. She asked whether Claire had been the person he talked to whenever they had an argument. Daniel nodded. Rachel felt a new kind of pain. Her private marriage had been discussed with the woman who was eventually going to become part of the reason it fell apart. Claire hadn't simply been watching from the outside. She had been hearing about Rachel's weaknesses, her fears, and her arguments with Daniel. She had been receiving information Rachel had shared in confidence. The betrayal was no longer just romantic. It was personal. Daniel stood up and tried to approach her. Rachel stepped backward. Don't, she said. He stopped. He told her he was sorry. He said he loved her. Rachel looked at him through tears and asked a question that had no easy answer. If you loved me, why did I have to find out this way? Daniel couldn't answer. Rachel walked upstairs and entered their bedroom. She looked around at the room they had shared for years. Their wedding photograph sat on the dresser. A framed picture of Emily and Matthew stood beside it. Everything looked exactly the same. But Rachel knew she would never see the room the same way again. Then she noticed something on the dresser she had never paid attention to before. A small envelope. She picked it up and opened it. Inside was a photograph of Daniel and Claire together. On the back was a handwritten date. Rachel stared at it. The date was not from a year ago. It was from 3 years earlier. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Daniel had just told her the affair had lasted almost a year. But the photograph suggested something very different. And suddenly, Rachel realized that even after everything he had admitted, Daniel might still be lying. Rachel stood beside the dresser, holding the photograph so tightly that the edges pressed into her fingers. She looked at Daniel, who had followed her upstairs, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she saw fear in his eyes. "You said almost a year," Rachel whispered. Daniel didn't answer. She turned the photograph around and showed him the date. "Then explain this." Daniel stared at it. His face lost what little color remained. Rachel waited. She had spent 24 years waiting for Daniel to tell her the truth whenever something went wrong. Now she realized that she had been waiting for honesty from someone who had become very comfortable with silence. Daniel finally admitted that the photograph was older than the affair. He said he and Claire had known each other for years and had crossed a line once before, but he insisted it had never become a relationship until the previous year. Rachel listened carefully. She wanted to believe there was still some boundary between the truth and another lie. Then she noticed something in Daniel's expression. He wasn't telling her everything. Rachel asked where the photograph had come from. Daniel said Claire had given it to him after an old neighborhood gathering. Rachel asked why he had kept it. Daniel said he didn't know. That answer made Rachel shake her head. "You don't keep a photograph like this for no reason." Daniel looked away. Rachel then asked the question that had been sitting inside her since the beginning. Was Claire the first woman? Daniel remained silent. Rachel's heart sank. She didn't need to hear the answer immediately. His silence had already answered it. Daniel eventually admitted that Claire wasn't the first person he had become emotionally involved with. There had been someone else years earlier, before Claire. Rachel felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath her. She wasn't dealing with one mistake anymore. She was looking at a pattern. 24 years of marriage suddenly looked different. Rachel remembered the unexplained trips, the late nights, the periods when Daniel seemed distant. She had spent years blaming herself for those moments. She had wondered whether she had been too busy, too tired, too focused on the children. Now she understood that some of those moments had nothing to do with her. Daniel tried to tell her that he had changed. He said he had never wanted to hurt her. He said the marriage had become difficult and that Claire had made him feel understood. Rachel listened until he finished. Then she asked him something very simple. "Did you ever give me the chance to understand you?" Daniel didn't respond. Rachel continued. "You say you were unhappy. You say you felt alone. But you never sat me down and told me. You didn't ask me to change. You didn't ask me to help. You went somewhere else." Daniel began crying. He told Rachel that he was sorry. He said he would end everything with Claire. He promised to go to counseling. He promised to rebuild their marriage. For a moment, Rachel simply looked at him. 24 years earlier, those promises might have been enough. But something had changed. Rachel wasn't asking whether Daniel could become the husband he wanted to be. She was asking whether she still wanted to be his wife. The next morning, Rachel packed a small suitcase. Daniel watched from the bedroom doorway. He asked where she was going. Rachel told him she needed somewhere quiet to think. She didn't say how long she would be gone. She didn't threaten him. She didn't tell him she hated him. In fact, she told him something that surprised even herself. "I don't hate you." Daniel looked relieved for a moment. Then Rachel continued, "But I don't trust you." The relief disappeared from his face. Rachel walked downstairs and looked around their home one last time. The dining table where their children had done homework. The kitchen where she and Daniel had celebrated birthdays. The living room where they had opened Christmas presents. So many memories were still there. The house hadn't betrayed her. The walls hadn't lied. The memories themselves weren't fake. But the person she had shared them with had made choices Rachel could no longer ignore. She placed her suitcase beside the front door and turned back toward Daniel. Before leaving, Rachel called Claire. Claire answered after several rings. Rachel didn't ask for another explanation. She simply told Claire that their friendship was over. Claire began crying and said she never wanted things to happen this way. Rachel closed her eyes. "Neither did I," she said. "But you knew exactly who I was." There was silence on the phone. Rachel continued. "You knew my children. You knew my marriage. You knew what Daniel meant to me. And you still made the choice you made." Claire apologized again. Rachel accepted the apology, but she didn't offer forgiveness. She understood something important. Forgiveness and reconciliation were not the same thing. She could eventually forgive Claire without ever allowing her back into her life. She could forgive Daniel without returning to the marriage. And she could remember the good years without pretending the bad ones hadn't happened. For the first time in weeks, Rachel felt something other than fear. She felt control returning. Rachel stayed with her sister for several weeks. During that time, Daniel called almost every day. Sometimes he apologized. Sometimes he asked her to come home. Sometimes he reminded her of their happiest memories. Rachel listened, but she no longer allowed those memories to make her forget the present. She began seeing a counselor and started rebuilding the parts of herself she had neglected during the marriage. She realized that she had spent years being a wife, a mother, and the person everyone depended on. Somewhere along the way, she had forgotten to ask herself what she wanted. Meanwhile, Daniel ended his relationship with Claire. At least, that's what he told Rachel. But Rachel no longer felt responsible for verifying his promises. Whether he kept them or broke them was his choice. Her choice was different. She had finally decided that she would no longer build her life around someone else's decisions. Months later, Rachel returned to the house to collect the rest of her belongings. Daniel wasn't there. She walked through the rooms slowly. In the bedroom, she found the old photograph again. She held it for a moment, then placed it into a box with other things from the marriage. She didn't destroy it. She didn't need to. The photograph no longer had power over her. It was simply evidence of a chapter in her life that had ended. Rachel walked outside and stood on the front porch. She looked at the house where she had spent 24 years and felt something unexpected. She was sad, but she wasn't broken. She had lost a marriage, a friendship, and the future she thought she was going to have. But she had also discovered something she hadn't known about herself. She could survive the truth. The truth had hurt her, but the lies had kept her trapped. Rachel eventually filed for divorce. It wasn't easy. There were difficult conversations, financial decisions, and painful discussions with their children. Emily struggled to understand how the father she loved could have done something that hurt their mother so deeply. Matthew was angry. Daniel wanted everyone to believe the family could eventually return to normal, but Rachel understood that normal was gone. What she could create instead was something different, something honest. She didn't tell her children to hate their father. She didn't ask them to choose sides. She simply told them the truth and allowed them to make their own decisions. Over time, the family found a new way to exist. It wasn't the family Rachel had imagined when she was 28, but it was real. And for Rachel, after everything she had experienced, real had become more valuable than perfect. A year after she left Daniel, Rachel returned to the same cafe where she had first seen him with Claire. She sat at a table by the window and ordered a cup of coffee. She looked across the street toward the parking lot where she had once watched her entire marriage change in front of her eyes. She remembered how frightened she had been that night. She remembered wondering whether she would ever feel happy again. Then she smiled, not because the betrayal had been forgotten, but because it no longer controlled her. Rachel had learned that betrayal doesn't always destroy a person. Sometimes it forces them to see the truth they were too afraid to face. Daniel had taken away the future Rachel thought she had. Claire had broken a friendship Rachel thought would last forever. But neither of them could decide what Rachel's next chapter would look like. And perhaps that is the part of Rachel's story that matters most. She didn't get the ending she wanted. She didn't get a perfect explanation that made 24 years of marriage suddenly make sense. She didn't wake up one morning and forget the pain. Instead, she did something much harder. She accepted that the person she trusted had made choices she couldn't control, and then she stopped allowing those choices to control her future. Rachel once believed the greatest tragedy would be losing Daniel. Eventually, she realized the greater tragedy would have been losing herself just to keep him. So she walked away, not because she had stopped caring, but because she finally understood that love without honesty could become a prison. And when Rachel closed the door behind her for the last time, she wasn't walking away from her life. She was finally walking back toward herself. If you had been Rachel, what would you have done? Would you have given Daniel another chance after 24 years of marriage? Or would the betrayal have been too deep to repair? And what about Claire? Can a friendship survive a betrayal like that? Or are some choices impossible to take back? Rachel's story leaves us with an uncomfortable question. How well can we ever truly know the people closest to us? Sometimes the warning signs aren't dramatic. Sometimes they're small enough to ignore: a changed routine, a hidden phone, an unexplained receipt, a story that doesn't quite add up. And sometimes the hardest truth isn't discovering that someone betrayed you. It's realizing that you trusted them enough to believe every explanation they gave you. Rachel couldn't change what Daniel and Claire had done, but she could decide what happened next. And that decision became the beginning of a life that belonged to her again.